Well, we're about halfway through 2 Samuel chapter 11, the story of David and Bathsheba. And when we last met, David had summoned Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, from the battlefield in the area of Rabbah and told him to come immediately to Jerusalem. Now, Uriah was a key military leader in David's army. In 2 Samuel 23, not there yet, of course, Uriah is listed as one of 30 named Giborim, meaning mighty men of Israel. So he was a senior military officer who would have been well known personally to David, if not to all of Israel. This was not some obscure rank and file army officer. In fact, there is evidence in later chapters that Bathsheba's father, Elam, may have been a high-ranking civilian official in David's royal court. This would account for Uriah's and Bathsheba's residence being inside the city walls of the city of David, a most prestigious location where few were permitted to live. Now, David had taken advantage of Uriah's absence to seduce his beautiful young wife, Bathsheba. And while in and of itself a pretty risky thing to do, some complications set in around 6 weeks later when Bathsheba sent word to David that she was now pregnant. And David's political self-preservation instinct kicked in. So he began to devise a means to cover up his despicable act. Oh, we've heard about that kind of stuff before, haven't we? His solution was to find an excuse to get Uriah to come home immediately, go to bed with his wife before there were any outward signs that she was carrying David's child. And then when her pregnancy became known, it would appear to everybody that the child was her husband, Uriah's. The problem was, Uriah wasn't cooperating. At least at first, Uriah wasn't quite sure what the matter was. It would prompt his king to just suddenly recall him from the battlefield. They were in the midst of a siege. In fact, no reason whatsoever is given by David to Uriah, so we can reasonably speculate that he didn't give him one. So when Bathsheba's husband arrives to the city of David and he reports to his king, David merely inquires about Joab, the commanding general, who's also his nephew, the overall state of the battle, the well-being of the Israelite soldiers, and Uriah dutifully answers all the king's questions, and he's a bit taken aback when David suggests that he just go on home and spend a little time with his wife. See, he assumes the king just hasn't gotten around yet to telling him the important reason that he brought Uriah here so unexpectedly. See, being a faithful officer in the Israelite army, bound in honor to his men, to Israel's national good, he chooses to stay readily available at the palace with the other men, all those who are in service to the king, as he waits for King David to ask of him whatever it was that was so important as to have him disengage from battle and rush to Jerusalem. But after a couple of failed attempts by David to get Uriah to go home, David's increasing insistence upon it starts to arouse some suspicion, especially since David keeps suggesting that the first thing he does when he goes home is to consort with his wife. And the ancient sages say that Uriah sensed something wasn't right, and that something may have transpired between David and Bathsheba. So Uriah invoked his military duty and his patriotism as the reason to refuse to go home. So now he's thwarting David's plan. Whether this was an intentional effort to sidestep King David's orders or it's just The behavior of a man displaying the highest level of faithfulness and obedience to his conscience, well, that's debatable. But David wouldn't be deterred. If Uriah was not going to become a willing dupe to this cover-up, then there was no choice. He had to be removed from the equation altogether. Let's pick up our story there. Open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 11. We're going to start at verse 14. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 340. 2 Samuel chapter 11, beginning at verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. And in the letter he wrote, "Put Uriah on the front lines of the fiercest fighting and then pull back from it, so that he'll be wounded and killed." So while Joab had the city under siege, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew the toughest defenders were, and the men of the city went out and fought Joab, and a number of people fell, including some of David's servants, with Uriah the Hittite among the dead. Now Joab sent a message to David reporting all the news concerning the war, and he instructed the messenger, "When you finish telling the king all the news about the war, he may become angry and ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Don't you know that they are going to shoot from the wall? Didn't you think about that person who struck Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth, that a woman threw an upper millstone down on him from the wall so that he died at Tebetz? Why did you go so near the wall?' And if he says this, tell him your servant Uriah is dead also." So the messenger left, and on arrival he told David that all that Joab had sent him to say. And the messenger said to David, "The men were overpowering us and came out after us into the countryside, but we chased them back all the way to the entrance of the city gate. The archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead. Also your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." And David said to the messenger, "Go tell Joab, don't let this matter get you down. The sword devours in one way or another. Intensify your battle against the city and overthrow it and encourage him." Well, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and took her home to his palace, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But Adonai saw what David had done was evil. A couple of lessons ago, I explained that while Christianity tends to make this a cute children's story, or one of intense passion and romance, Judaism traditionally turns the story on its head, and it makes David a hero. It makes Uriah a bad guy, in order that David fulfills their view as a near-perfect human who possesses every positive attribute of a Messiah. Thus, Uriah's refusal to obey David and go home to his wife and go to bed with her is viewed as insubordination, rebellion, even though by now Bathsheba's husband may have been suspicious that something had occurred. Now, the reality of this is obviously otherwise. While indeed Uriah, the battle-hardened soldier and intelligent military officer, probably smelled a rat, everything he did displayed a great faithfulness and allegiance to his king and to the God of Israel. In fact, what comes next paints Uriah as either the most amazingly loyal of troops or the most naive. And there can't be any doubt that he's the former rather than the latter. In verse 14, David wrote a message for Uriah to take with him back to the siege and to give it to his commander, Joab. Uriah is essentially carrying with him his own death warrant. And yet the irony is that the homicidal and the adulterous David fully understands that Uriah is so trustworthy, he's so dedicated, there is no reason to wonder if he might open up that message and read it. To be sure, the means of this communication was a scroll with a wax seal affixed to it that made tampering with it obvious. Nonetheless, Uriah could have devised any number of ways to view the contents or offer some solid excuse as to why it had been opened, should what was inside turn out to just be benign, his suspicions were wrong. On the other hand, the scroll could have been lost accidentally and never delivered to Joab at all. Uriah could even have chosen to defect to some other nation if he confirmed David's intentions to have him eliminated. Now, the contents of this letter are chilling. David knows that his seduction of Bathsheba is going to become public sooner or later, and that he has no chance of pinning Bathsheba's pregnancy on her husband because the entire royal court has now just witnessed Uriah doggedly refusing to leave the palace. So David compounds his adultery with conspiracy to commit murder. And by the law of Moses, both adultery and murder require capital punishment. Of course, David's the king, and there is no way he's going to suffer such consequences at the hand of men. So David is by no means attempting to save his own life by his actions. Rather, this is all about politics. It's all about sexual lust, something that has gone hand in hand since time immemorial, because the common denominator for both is the desire for power. Now, as cold-blooded as are David's instructions to have Uriah killed, so they are equally as improbable and clumsy. One can only imagine Joab getting the scroll, opening it, reading it, and thinking his uncle must be losing his grip, because these instructions are fanciful, if not downright delusional. David tells Joab to have Uriah sent to the front of the fighting, and then have all men suddenly pull back and abandon him, and that way the enemy can easily kill him. Joab knew this was impossible. First of all, Uriah himself commanded the troops. Second, what intelligent, experienced, and aware soldier would simply stand there and allow himself to be left behind as the others all left? But Joab is himself a consummate political animal. He's a family member of David's. And so keeping his high-ranking position, now that's job one. So he fully understands that while David's prescribed method is absurd, the intent's unambiguous. Get Uriah killed, so that it appears there was just another sad battlefield death. And Joab coldly calculates the best way to accomplish that without regard to the morality of the act. And in order to give David's plan some credibility, verses 16 and 17 explain how Joab accomplishes King David's wishes. Knowing that if you're going to make an omelet, you're going to have to break a few eggs, Joab sends Uriah along with what have been some of his own men, Uriah's men, to where the fighting was the most dangerous during the siege, right next to the city walls. Several Israelite troops were killed by these Ammonites, along with Uriah. Mission accomplished. And according to the rabbis, justice was served, because David was legally entitled to have Uriah put to death because he'd been disrespectful. He hadn't obeyed David to go home and have sex with his wife, Bathsheba. I don't think I need to spend any time disputing such a hopelessly ill-conceived claim. This might be a good time to pause, though, for a moment and talk about something that we're all familiar with, I'm sad to say. Dutifully following orders, no matter how illegitimate or immoral they might be. And then when confronted with our dastardly deed, we put up the defense. We're just doing our job. was just doing my job. So we ought to be held immune by God and men. The reality is that in that situation, in God's view, we're nothing less than co-conspirators to intentional wrongdoing against him. See, such a thing can take many subtle forms. Joab's was a classic. But since we're in the endless political silly season, another good example would be the outright lies and distortions hurled by one opponent towards the other in hopes of eventually winning an election, or the pronouncement of a litany of outright false promises that the politician has no intention of keeping. But of course, the candidate for office invariably has a highly paid team behind him who advises and creates the narrative, and so the advertising puts forth all of these falsehoods. And what's their rationale for avoiding any responsibility for this? It's my job. It's what I was hired to do. It's just part of the process. It's usual and customary. It's just what I was hired to do. We all know politicians don't tell the truth. They have one face for the public, another behind closed doors. So for them distorting or withholding the truth, that's just a daily part of their profession. So they ought not be seen wrong, or as criminals, or even as that should be indicative of their true character. So the person who aids them, they must be even more innocent. How about those highly paid corporate accountants who are instructed by upper management to manipulate numbers, to make falsified reports, even though they know full well it's all full of inaccuracies? What's the excuse for complying? I'm innocent because I just did what I was told to do. It's not my job to judge my boss. I could lose my job if I didn't do it. How about that real estate agent? It helps his client hide serious defects in the property he's selling to an unwitting buyer who would never complete the sale if they found out. Or a lawyer who has the legal right to know with certainty that his client is guilty as charged, but works to have them exonerated to completely escape justice and then go out and offend again. How about that doctor that overcharges for some tests or procedures on your behalf so that the insurance will pay enough to cover the legitimate charges, and thus he makes more, but it costs you less? How about a pastor, priest, a rabbi, who teaches his congregation a doctrine or a religious principle that he knows isn't biblically supported, but it does harmonize with his denominational creed, to which he's vowed fidelity. And so teaching allows that person to maintain their position in the church or the synagogue that employs them. See, killing Uriah wasn't Joab's idea. He didn't even seem to have anything personally against him. But Joab was every bit as guilty as David, because it's one thing to send men into harm's way in war, knowing that the inevitable result of a legitimate battle is that men are going to lose their lives. But it's quite another to knowingly use the enemy as a means of killing a comrade that you want dead. Joab was just trying to please his king. He was just trying to do as he was told. Now he has blood guilt on his head. David did too. And yet, neither one of them wielded the weapon that killed Bathsheba's husband. Let him who has ears hear this. Joab sends a courier back to Jerusalem. He tells David about this initial setback near the walls of Rabbah, in which Israel suffered tragic casualties. Wanting to be cautious and not fully trusting the messenger to be as blindly loyal as himself, Joab disguises the part of the message that David is anxiously waiting to hear by making it seem as though Uriah's death was just an incidental part of the report. He fully expected David to understand the intent. However, if David became angry by failing to understand that the deaths of the other soldiers was just necessary collateral damage in order for the king's command to kill Uriah to be carried out, then the messenger was to emphasize Uriah's demise. And indeed, David got angry when he heard the report. David couldn't fathom why Joab would do something so fundamentally unsound from a military tactical viewpoint as to put his men directly under those city walls where they were vulnerable and they were bound to suffer casualties. However, David's anger stemmed more from Joab not going about things like David had ordered, no matter how ridiculous and impossible they were, than he was about these soldiers being killed. And you know what? His callous response to what the messenger tells him about all these dead soldiers demonstrates this. See, David's reply that he sent back to Joab sounds to the messenger like a standard soldier's cliche. Oh, don't let this get you down. You know, the sword devours in one way or another. See, it's like troops in our day saying, every bullet has its billet. But because David's intent was to send a coded message back to Joab that he understood why the other soldiers had to die in order for Uriah to be killed, David's words are as full of deceit and cold-blooded and devised so that the messenger would be none the wiser of it. Oh well, if a few unimportant foot soldiers die, so what? That's just the price of success. That's just the reasonable cost for David to achieve his cover-up, keeping his reputation clean, and getting the girl. Now, as we're going to see in the next chapter, David's exact words are going to come back to haunt him. It's also going to haunt his family in ways David never could have imagined. Now, this chapter ends with Bathsheba getting warned about her husband's death and engaging in the standard ritual mourning protocol. Now, the mourning protocol would have been for 7 days. And immediately, we find rabbis admitting that the way the wording of verse 26 is structured, it makes it that following, right away, the 7 days of mourning, David sent for Bathsheba and married her. The reason for this haste, beyond his raging lust and impatience, is that by now, Bathsheba was probably getting close to 3 months pregnant. And her growing belly soon going to show. Marrying the widow of a deceased man was not unusual in that era. In fact, recall that David married Abigail under very similar circumstances, and it wasn't at all deemed evil by God, at least so far as we know. However, marrying Bathsheba so quickly was just all part of a cover-up plan. And in some ways, it was for her benefit, so that she wouldn't be humiliated and shunned when her condition became apparent. It's interesting, I think, that we find David's descendant, Mary, mother of Yeshua, pregnant before formal marriage, and her betrothed, Joseph, marrying her, we're told, partly to save Miriam the embarrassment of being pregnant out of wedlock. Now, of course, the circumstances aren't exact. And the motives pure in David and Bathsheba's case, but you can't ignore the parallel. It's very, very interesting. The final verse of this chapter has the narrator doing the thing that on one level makes the Bible trustworthy and the believable document that it is. And in all eras, the faithful biographer of a king did not record anything but the acts of merit and courage that were displayed by his employer. especially in the scores of thousands of Egyptian and Syrian and Mesopotamian and other ancient documents uncovered and translated, kings and royalty are held up as having impeccable character, absolutely never committing a wrong. But in the Bible, even the greatest heroes, such as David, have their worst deeds, even their worst thoughts, exposed. There is no effort by the inspired biblical writers to place these men and women, in some cases, on heavenly pedestals, even though both Christianity and Judaism often do anyway. Now, without equivocation, the writer of the David and Bathsheba episode says that the Lord God saw what David had done was evil. And the Lord can't allow evil to stand unpunished. The next chapter shows that even God's anointed, his specially chosen, his beloved, is not above divine justice. So with that, let's read 2 Samuel chapter 12. That's on page 345 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Second Samuel chapter 12, starting at verse 1. Adonai sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, in a certain city there were two men, one rich, one poor. And the rich man had vast flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except for one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and reared. It had grown up with him, with his children, and ate from his plate, drank from his cup, lay on his chest. It was like a daughter to him. And one day, a traveler visited the rich man, and instead of picking an animal from his own flock or herd to cook for his visitor, he took that poor man's lamb, and he cooked it for the man who had come to him. David exploded with anger against that man and said to Nathan, as Adonai lives, the man who did that deserves to die. For doing such a thing, he has to pay. He has to be pay back 4 times the value of the lamb because he has no pity. And Nathan said to David, you're that man. Here's what Adonai, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel. I rescued you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives to embrace. I gave you the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and if that had been too little, I would have added to you a lot more. So why have you shown such contempt for the word of Adonai and done what I see as evil? You murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you took his wife as your own wife. You put him to death with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now therefore the sword will never leave your house, because you have shown contempt for me. And you've taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite as your own wife. Here is what Adonai says. I will generate evil against you out of your own household. I will take your wives from before your very eyes and give them to your neighbor. He will go out, he will go to bed with your wives, and everybody will know about it. For you did it secretly. I'll do this before all Israel in broad daylight. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against Adonai. And Nathan said to David, Adonai has also taken away your sin. You will not die. However, because by this act you have so greatly blasphemed Adonai, the child born to you must die. Then Nathan returned to his house. Adonai struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and it became very ill. David prayed to God on behalf of the child. David fasted, then came and lay all night on the ground. And the court officials got up and stood next to him, trying to get him off the ground, but he refused. He wouldn't eat food with them. And on the 7th day, the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, because they said, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him and he didn't listen to us. If we tell him now that the child is dead, he may do himself some harm. But when David saw his servants whispering to each other, he suspected the child was dead, and David asked his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they answered, "He is dead." Then David got up off the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. And he went into the house of Adonai and he worshipped. Then he went to his own palace, and when he asked for food, they served it to him, and he ate. His servants asked him, "What are you doing? You fasted and wept for the child while it was alive, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat food." And he answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, because I thought maybe Adonai will show his grace to me and let the child live. But now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he won't return to me." David comforted his wife Bathsheba. He came to her and went to bed with her, and she gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. Adonai loved him and sent through Nathan the prophet to have him named Yedidah, meaning loved by God, for Adonai's sake. Joab fought against Rabbah of the people of Ammon and took the royal city. Joab sent people to David with this message, "I have fought against Rabbah and captured its water supply. Therefore assemble the rest of the people and lay siege to the city and capture it. Otherwise, I will capture the city, and it will be named after me." David assembled all the people, and he went to Rabbah, and he fought against it and captured it. He took the crown off of Malcolm's head. It weighed 66 pounds with its gold and precious stones. It was placed on David's head. He carried off great quantities of spoil from the city. And in addition, he expelled the people who were in it and sent them to work with saws, iron harrows, and iron axes, or had them cross over to work in the brick factory. This is what he did to all the cities of the people of Ammon. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. I want to quote to you something written by a wonderful Jewish scholar, Rabbi Nahshon Sherman, as directly concerns our study. But it also pertains to David being a shadow and a type of Messiah. Now, I think that while Judaism doesn't recognize that the Messiah has come, and thus some of the mystery about Messiah that they still see as existing has actually already been resolved. On the other hand, Judaism does see certain elements of this link between David and Messiah that believers often overlook. Rabbi Sherman says this: "From its very beginning, the process through which the Davidic dynasty and the eventual King Messiah were to come into being has been mysterious. It's been hidden. The nation of Moab, the nation that Ruth, the ancestress of David, came from, that nation came into being when Lot lived incestuously with his daughter. Peretz, the ancestor of David, was born from this strange relationship of Judah and Tamar. David descended from the marriage of Ruth and Boaz, a relationship that some criticize as being a violation of halakha. David's dynasty descended from his marriage with Bathsheba, which was so shrouded in obvious impropriety. So while on the one hand, I can't overlook, and I can't teach you to overlook, the obvious violence done to the Holy Scriptures concerning David is done by sages and rabbis that are so anxious to hold David above all wrongdoing, and perhaps as the most pious man ever to live. On the other hand, those same men have done us a great service in setting the stage for a much richer understanding of the nature and of the purpose of our Messiah, if only we'll get outside of our many man-made doctrines that act more like barriers to God's enlightenment than they are road markers to truth. One of the means to apprehending a much more thorough understanding of David and some deeper insights into biblical messianic principles is by reading the Psalms. And yet, It's important not to read the Psalms like they were a book, just one after the other, but rather read each psalm in the context of the events and the circumstances under which they were created. It's the only way we're going to get to their true essence. Psalms 32 and 51 are directly related to what we are studying as regards David and Bathsheba. David wrote them in the midst of what we're currently reading in 2 Samuel. Thus, to exclude them from our study would be to leave large blanks left unfilled that could give us insight into what David was thinking, what he was feeling throughout his self-made trials and self-caused exile from God. Now, we're not going to thoroughly study these Psalms, but I would like for us to read them, and I'd like to make a few comments about them that I think are appropriate for our purposes. These were not necessarily written in the order that they're numbered in our Bibles. In fact, I strongly suspect that Psalm 51 was written before Psalm 32. Nonetheless, I want to begin by reading Psalm 32. So open your Bibles to Psalm 32. Psalm 32. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it is page 819, 819. Psalm 32. I'm going to read it all. How blessed are those whose offense is forgiven, those whose sin is covered. How blessed those to whom Adonai imputes no guilt, in whose spirit is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away because of my groaning all day long. Day and night your hand was heavy on me. The sap in me dried up as in a summer drought. And when I acknowledged my sin to you, when I stopped concealing my guilt and said, I will confess my offenses to Adonai, then you forgave the guilt of my sin. This is what everyone faithful should pray at a time when you can be found. Then when the floodwaters are raging, they will not reach to him. You are a hiding place for me. You will keep me from distress. You will surround me with songs of deliverance. I will instruct and teach you in this way that you are to go. I will give you counsel. My eyes will be watching you. Don't be like a horse or a mule that has no understanding, that has to be curbed with bit and bridle, or else it won't come near you. Many are the torments of the wicked, but grace surrounds those who trust in Adonai. Be glad in Adonai. Rejoice, you righteous. Shout for joy, all you upright in heart. Even though it is fully halfway through 2 Samuel chapter 12, and after Nathan has read David the riot act on God's behalf, before we see David openly confess his sins, I want to prepare us for when we get to that particular verse with some key points from Psalm 32. As with us all, despite how we might outwardly appear to be confident in the rightness of our actions and content that we have good status before the Lord, seemingly sailing along, unimpeded on the course that God set out for us, when we belong to the Lord, our hidden wrongdoing is not going to allow us any rest. That was David's situation. It didn't take Nathan delivering God's oracle for David to recognize that he was being eaten alive from the inside out. Rather, it took Nathan's message for him to take the required action to reverse that process. The burden of his sin was terrible. And because David refused to face it, his heart was like a piece of raw meat dropped into a glass of Coke. It was shriveling up. It was turning rancid. It was about to become unusable. David had committed the terrible sin of adultery with Bathsheba because he had way too much time on his hands. And this was because he had decided to sit in Jerusalem in comfort and safety rather than go out with his army to holy war, as he should have. The Lord had moved away from him because David had decided to reign as though he was a Gentile king. The sin with Bathsheba came about well down the line of a steady process of David moving away from the Lord. Sin begets other sin. That's how it works. Little ones lead to more and bigger ones. And the big ones, they lead to horrific ones. David did not spot Bathsheba and then instantly have murderous intentions towards her husband. He didn't even know to think that way. I think his first thought was that he wanted Bathsheba for his harem. But more, he simply wanted her because he was just impulsively overcome with lust. I suspect that if he could have called upon her for sexual favors from time to time as the urge moved him, he may well have been satisfied enough with that arrangement. But out of his adultery came something he hadn't counted on, her pregnancy. So next, David tried to deal with the fallout of that sin that resulted in her pregnancy by quickly calling her husband home from war, again, and at the outset, no intentions to harm the man, so that Uriah can have relations with his wife, having no idea his wife was already a few weeks pregnant. And then Uriah and everybody else just assumes the child will be his and everybody's happy. Well, when this failed, David panicked. He took yet another step further away from God and brought blood guilt upon himself when he ordered Uriah to be murdered. Thus, David would try to solve this now complex web of sin by immediately marrying the widow, which he was certain would be publicly seen as a wonderful, merciful thing to do. She would later have that baby she was carrying, but the public didn't know that yet. So he'd be home free. Political problem solved. Whew. Got by that one, dodged that bullet. Problem is, God's economy didn't work that way. Sin always demands a payment. God's justice isn't set aside for anyone, ever. But beyond that, Psalm 32 shows how David learned an invaluable lesson. Confession is essentially the point at which we finally shove our foot on the brake, crank that steering wheel hard to the left, and make a U-turn. Confession is the key to restoring our relationship with God. Confession is when the raw meat is removed from that glass of Coke and the harsh chemical reaction begins to subside. In Psalm 32, verse 3, David says it this way: "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away." Silence and lack of acknowledgement of our sin causes us to waste away. David had to outwardly admit his sin. He had to acknowledge the terribleness of what he had done and that it was a violation against God and man. He had to take personal responsibility for it. And until he did, nothing was going to change in his life. It's not that he had to draw a crowd and confess to them. We don't have to go on Oprah and pour our soul out to strangers to be counted as having confessed. Therefore, says verse 5, "When I acknowledge my sin to you, You forgave the guilt of my sin. It is not to people, but to God, that we have to acknowledge our sin. We must confess to Him, not to our rabbi, not to our pastor, not to our priest. Now, there's a very important principle contained in here that we mustn't overlook. And it is one that many of our brethren have been taught to deny, and the ramifications of this go deep. And that denial is a result of a damaging disrespect for God's Word that started infecting the church centuries ago. It is that grace and not sacrifices brings us righteousness before God. Wait a minute. What did I just say? Haven't I been taught all along that we're forgiven by grace? Actually, let me tell you what you've been taught. You've been taught that grace is a New Testament dispensation brought about by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. You've never been taught. You've been taught that grace never existed before the New Testament era. So the Old Testament is just an obsolete, faulty system of bloody sacrifices, and that's the path to atonement. So the Old Testament is redemption by law and animal sacrifices. And in the New Testament, it's redemption by grace, a concept that was first introduced by Christ. Listen to verse 10 again. Many are the torments of the wicked, but grace surrounds those who trust in Adonai. Be glad in Adonai. Rejoice, you righteous. Shout for joy, all you upright in heart. Grace surrounds those who trust in Adonai. Rejoice, you righteous, because your righteousness is the result of grace. And that grace comes by your trust in the God of Israel. Shout for joy, all you upright in heart. Having a circumcised heart is the issue, not having a circumcised flesh. David wasn't pronouncing prophecy. He was pronouncing a present and existing truth that stood before the pillars of the world were established. You see, part of the reason that David is so keen to speak about grace and confession in this psalm is because of the blood guilt of murder that's upon his head. The law provides no means of animal sacrificial atonement for a murderer. And by the way, not for an adulterer either. There is no ritual protocol to pay for murder. But there is the life of the murderer that must be forfeit as payment. So if David is indeed forgiven as God says he is, and there is no animal sacrifice available to facilitate his forgiveness for sin, what does David actually view as this divine dynamic that produced forgiveness for him? Grace. Grace. And the reality is that despite the divine call for animal sacrifices, in the end, it's always been grace that saves us from the death penalty, not the blood of bulls and goats. Even the rabbis of old understood that the animal sacrifices were actually about obedience to God. There was no mystical quality to the spilled blood. And true obedience is born of trust. It's not legalistic. It's not mechanical observance of rules. It's not that animal carcasses or that their blood possesses some inherent ability to cleanse us from our sins. It's that God in His grace set up a system that allowed His people a way to overcome their sin and a means to get back into fellowship with Him if It was observed with the proper understanding of confession, repentance, and trust. The system was a visible and tangible means for humans to comprehend this spiritual reality. That system involved sacrifice of an innocent creature as a substitute for the guilty party. It still does. It's just that instead of our being obedient to the sacrificial protocol of animals, we are to be obedient to the sacrificial protocol of Yeshua. In both cases, the underlying element of sacrifice was God's grace. Redemption has always been by grace, not by law, not by anything else. But what a difficult concept this is for human beings to fully grasp. David grasped it, and he's communicating it here in Psalm 32. Okay, let's stop, and we're going to continue with the aftermath of David's sin with Bathsheba and these deep God principles that are highlighted next time. Please rise.